well. So, hi everyone. Very excited to have you here today. My name is Ishani Surya, and I actually work for Blue Stoop, and this program is in partnership with the Authors Guild. We have Erin Lowry here today to talk about finances for freelancers and writers, a very important topic, and I'm going to give you a full bio on her, but I just want to tell you a little bit about Blue Stoop as well. So we are based in Philadelphia, and we nurture an inclusive literary community, and we create pathways to access writing education, inspiration, professional support, and we also celebrate Philadelphia's rich writing tradition. We offer classes and events as well as other resources, but overall, we envision a radically inclusive literary community where Philadelphia readers and writers are thriving and supported. So I will drop some links to our website as well in the chat, so please do check us out. But now to our guest for the evening. Erin Lowry is the author of the 3-part Broke Millennial series, including Broke Millennial Takes On Investing, and Broke Millennial Talks Money, script stories and advice to navigate awkward financial conversations. Erin has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and on CBS Sunday Morning, CNBC, and the Rachael Ray Show. She has written for the New York Times, USA Today, and Bloomberg Opinion. For the Authors Guild, she has hosted the webinar series, Money Matters, on financial education for writers. So thank you so much for being here, Erin. I have a couple of questions in my back pocket that I am looking forward to asking, but I hope that all the attendees will put their questions in the Q&A of Zoom as well, and we will absolutely do our best to get to them and chat about what's on your mind as well. But I wanted to start off today sort of broadly. What, Erin, would you say are the greatest opportunities and challenges financially when you're working as a writer?
Oh, such a loaded question. So many. I would say first with opportunities, it's truly unlimited income potential in a lot of ways. And on the flip side, it can be so overwhelming to figure out how to be earning an income. And oftentimes, one thing that I'm just going to bring up early and we can kind of discuss throughout is there is this sometimes a mentality that we get as creatives where there's this sacred space of being a writer, and therefore you are unwilling to do either other types of jobs, other types of day jobs, other types of writing, because you think of yourself only as one type of writer. And I do think that it's very important to really shed this idea that being a starving artist is more pure than being an artist who makes a lot of money, because that is just fundamentally not true. And it is really important that you consider yourself a business person and an artist at the same time, particularly if you are self-employed and doing this alone, or maybe with one or two other people. Talking and collaborating is a very important thing that we'll bring up later. But I do think it's incredibly important to have a business mind about your art as well as being an artist. And I just want to get rid of any notions that you're not good at money because you're creative. You're not good at money because you're not good at math. Math was never, ever my strong suit in school. I never studied finance. I did not work at a bank. And I write about money professionally for a living. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm a storyteller. And that really is what led me to doing my job. I like to call myself a financial translator more than anything else, because I figure out how to take these complicated topics and I interview all the really smart, experienced people and then put that through the machine of getting the jargon out for us normals to be able to understand how to work with our money.
I love that. And I love that you referenced math class, because of course my parents were always like, you're terrible at math. So I relate. But I'm curious, when you're talking about jargon, the thing that comes to mind for me is tax season, which we kind of are in the midst of. And I'm sort of curious about a couple of things with tax season. So the first thing is, when do you need an accountant? Should we be getting accountants? And how does that work?
I say yes, especially if you have many streams of income. If you've worked a lot of different gigs Some of that might be full-time work. Some of that might be traditionally employed, but then you also have a mix of writing for a bunch of different outlets. And if you get a stack of papers like this big come tax season from all of your clients, and some clients maybe never even sent you that paperwork in the first place, and you have to like make sure to self-report, yes, it is very helpful to have an accountant. And it doesn't have to be super expensive either. It's not like, oh, I have to have made $250,000 to justify having an accountant. You can truly have someone who maybe charges you a couple $100 to go through the process of filing your return. And I bet you they will find at least a couple $100 worth of value in your return, so they kind of pay for themselves. In terms of finding one, there are websites that you can obviously check out, but I would tap into your network, especially fellow creatives, talking to other authors, particularly maybe somebody who does the kind of work that you do, or perhaps has a hybrid of traditionally employed and making side hustle money, or exclusively self-employed. Ask who they use. Do they like that person? Maybe get names of people they didn't particularly like and why. And use that network that you have as a resource to find your person, and make sure that your accountant has worked with somebody in similar situations to you before. If you have an accountant who exclusively works with corporate America folks who just make a lot of money and are looking for certain tax loopholes, they're not necessarily going to be the person that you want answering all the questions about, how do I file self-employment tax? Is my LLC right? Am I like figuring out all the information about how to minimize my taxes as a creative, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be the first big thing that I would recommend when looking for an accountant. Reach out to your network, and you don't have to be married to the first one that you find. You might figure out like, oh, this person doesn't really work for me, or they're not taking the time to answer my questions. And as long as you didn't find them on like, I don't know, April 10th and taxes are due April 15th, then yes, they might not be taking the time as they normally would. But in a long-term relationship, you want this to be someone you're comfortable with, who takes the time and answers your questions. And it's okay if you feel dumb asking a question of your accountant. You shouldn't. Like, we were mostly never taught tax stuff. Again, I write about money professionally, and tax season deeply stresses me out every year. I have anxiety dreams every year that the IRS is going to come knocking on my door, be like, hey, you screwed all this up. You owe us $1 gajillion, or you're going to jail. Like, I think we all have that kind of anxiety. So having somebody who professionally knows what they're doing is very helpful.
Yeah, I feel like I've run into that too, sort of like a lack of transparency with accountants. Sometimes maybe they feel like I don't care, like, you know, I'm not a person, maybe they think that I just want to give them the paperwork and be done. But sometimes I think actually having that transparency is useful, so I know if I'm doing things right throughout the year as well.
Yes. And if you're somebody who needs to be paying quarterly estimated taxes, I really think having an accountant year long is incredibly beneficial for that purpose. So it's somebody who can help make sure that you are paying the proper amount in quarterly estimated taxes. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, basically for us self-employed folks, or even if you're traditionally employed but making a fair amount of money from a side hustle, the government, the IRS, wants its money along the whole year. It doesn't want to wait till the very end of the year. So every quarter, we are required to file quarterly estimated taxes. So paying our taxes, since most of the time when we receive money from clients, they have not paid taxes on our behalf. So it is important to make sure that you have somebody who can help you with that if you feel uncomfortable doing it yourself.
Yeah. And then tell me a little bit, and I'm not even sure if I'm using the right terminology here, but about like a tax write-off if you're self-employed. Like, what are things that you can kind of claim?
You definitely should ask an accountant that question. And the reason I say this is it varies based on industry. Even it can vary based on the type of writer that you are. And there are some weird loopholes. So for instance, one of the ones that I found the most bizarre is a couple of years ago, I do media segments quite frequently. And so I hired a stylist at one point in time to help me refresh my wardrobe for media. Now, the clothes that I purchased did not count as a tax write-off, but the fee that I paid to a stylist did count as a tax write-off because it was beneficial to my business. So there are just some weird things where like the clothes don't count, but the stylist fee can count. And so when it comes to being a writer, if you're doing a certain kind of research for a project, maybe you need to take a trip to explore a city that you're basing your story in, certain parts or certain percentages of that trip, assuming it's actually for work and not like, I'm going to spend one day researching and then 7 days having fun with my friends, that some of that can be counted as a write-off. Taking trips that you need, driving to meetings or taking public transit to meetings, coffees with friends that like it might qualify as a friend, but this might be actually like a business conversation, lunches, dinners, like there's all sorts of different things that can potentially be write-offs. You want to have that be coming out of a business bank account would be my first big thing. And you want those charged on a business credit card. And I say that just for when you're filing your taxes, there can be like true separation between this is personal and this is business, and it's much easier for you to track. Plus all of the stuff that it takes to, keep up with your business, whether it's paying for like a QuickBooks or, an invoicing system, thinking about the website and the domain that you're paying for, all of those new headshots, all of those kind of expenses, as long as realistically it makes sense for your job, which for most of us it does, that could potentially be a tax write-off. So you want to keep meticulous track and receipts. One big thing I would also say, if you're going out to like dinners or drinks or what have you, when you take a picture of the receipt to have a memory of like, this is something that I charged, write a note at the top, like this was with so-and-so for this meeting on this date. So it's a nice thing in case the IRS comes a calling, you have a record of it.
Definitely. Those are all great tips. I now need to go make a business account, basically. So I want to chat a little bit as well about retirement. And if others have questions about taxes, please put them in the Q&A as well. But I'm kind of curious, what do you do for retirement if you don't have a company that gives you a match, or what are your options?
When we think about traditionally employed folks, the terminology we're typically saying is a 401k. That's the language you're going to hear. That is just the name of a certain type of retirement plan. 403b might be another thing that you've heard or even had offered to you. Typically that's if you're in the nonprofit world, you have access to a 403b. It's 401k, 403b, usually for the traditionally employed. For the self-employed, we have a whole host of other options. So I'm going to throw some terms out there. The two front runners that you're going to hear about all the time, and you often will also hear about this if you're traditionally employed, is an IRA, individual retirement arrangement. Sometimes they say account. So IRA, there are two main types, Roth and traditional. It's going to get a little technical for a second, so bear with me. All that has to do with is your taxes. So a Roth IRA, which you'll always hear people be like, oh my God, if you're young, Roth IRA is the way to go. And the reason they say that is because money that goes into a Roth IRA gets put in post-tax. That means you've already paid tax on the money and it's going into that Roth IRA account. So the advantage is in the future, like 40, 50, 60 years, when you're in retirement and taking that money out, you've already paid taxes on it. So you get to take that money out tax-free. So there is zero tax advantage today. It does not lower your income for taxes, but in the future, or hopefully you're in a higher tax bracket because you've earned all this money and you have all this money in your Roth IRA, you get to take it out tax-free. A traditional IRA is just the reverse. You're putting money in pre-tax. It lowers your taxable income. So let's say that this year you made $50,000, you put $6,000 into your IRA. Well, now that's lowered the amount of money that you've made to $44,000. So you pay a little less in tax now, but in the future, you have to pay tax on it when you pull it out. Now, I just make those distinctions because Roth also can come up about 401ks, Roth 401k, and then traditional 401k. It just has to do with your taxes when you're paying taxes on the money that's in the account. For self-employed people though, IRAs are great, traditional or Roth, but there's one little problem. It maxes out at about $6,000. You can only put $6,000 in, $7,000 if you are over, I believe it's 50 or 55. Just double check with the IRS. You can do catch-up contributions. Now that might sound like a lot of money, but in the long run, by comparison to a 401k that you can put in like over $19,000 in and get an employer match on, $6,000 is pretty much chump change. So we have a few other choices at our disposal. You can do something called a SEP, Self-Employed Pension, SEP IRA. I could not tell you why the word pension is in there. That is just what this thing is called. But a SEP IRA is an option exclusively for self-employed people, which technically counts if you have a traditional job and you're making side hustle money. you still could technically open one. You just need money that's outside of your day job. But the SEP IRA has much higher contribution limits. And that makes it a really big advantageous situation for people like you and me who are making all of this money as self-employed folks. And you might be getting to the point where like, hey, I can put in a lot more than $6,000, and it gives you the option to do so. There's also stuff called a solo 401k and a few other different IRA options that are specifically for self-employed people. I don't want to get too much into the weeds about all of these different accounts, but what I do want to harp on a little bit is the importance of actually putting money into them and making sure that money is actually invested. There is a really big problem, and we as writers should really think about the fact that language matters so much. The words that we use have a lot of power. And unfortunately, the financial services community at large have done us a disservice by saying, save for retirement. You are not saving. You are investing for retirement. And I think that that little word is actually doing a fair amount of people some damage for a couple of reasons. One, you might already be an investor and not even realize it and not be thinking of yourself as an empowered investor. Because if you have a 401k or if you have an IRA, you're investing if that money is actually invested. The other reason this has done a lot of damage is people hear the term save for retirement, diligently put money into these retirement accounts, but never actually pick investments because it can be overwhelming. You might forget that you never did it. You might be thinking, oh, I signed up the paperwork to automatically be contributing to my 401k. I thought that was it. But if you never actually picked the investments, your money might truly just be sitting there in a savings account, which over the course of the decades that hopefully you are investing into your retirement account could be the difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars if it's being saved versus being invested. So please, if you have a retirement account of any variety, make sure that money is actually invested. And if you don't know how to do that, you log into your account. If you see the word settlement fund or cash management fund next to all of your money, it is sitting in cash. If the money hasn't really risen much by comparison to like, hey, I put in $200 a month and it looks like I put $200 a month in there over the last 5 years, and there's not been a whole lot of movement upwards, it's probably sitting in cash and not been invested. Because if it's been invested, you're going to be seeing more growth. And also pick up the phone and call customer service for whoever the brokerage is that houses your 401k, like a Fidelity or a Transamerica or a Vanguard. If you know you have an IRA, any of those brokerages, call the customer service and be like, I just want to check and make sure that the money in my 401k or my IRA is actually invested. So that is the soapbox I always get on when it comes to retirement. And finally, just remember, as a self-employed person, if you do not have a day job that is offering and matching a 401k for you that you are contributing to, it is all on you. No one has your back in this particular situation. So please make sure that you are actually putting money away for retirement, no matter what age you are. I think sometimes younger folks think like, yeah, I have a lot of time. And people who are maybe a little bit further along in their career but haven't done it feel like, oh, it's too late for me. It's not. And it's really important to get started. And we can talk a little bit in a few minutes about strategies to actually make sure that you have money set aside for that.
Yeah, that's all extremely helpful. And I'm wondering about people who might have questions about particular circumstances. Do you find that a retirement planner might be a resource that people should invest in?
No, not a retirement planner, a certified financial planner. That's the term I want you to know and use. So unfortunately, when it comes to financial planners and services, there is a lot of shady business, is the way I will probably tactfully say that. And part of that is because there's actually very little regulation about the terms financial planner and financial advisor. A lot of people can use that terminology when they're fundamentally just selling you a product. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if you realize, hey, I need a life insurance policy, and you're like, I've seen this commercial and these people say that they have a life insurance policy. I'm not going to throw shade and name names of particular companies, but we all know them and know their jingles. So if you call them up and you get someone on the phone who might say like, oh yes, I'm a financial advisor. Yeah, that's just a term. And that might mean that that person passed like one test to be able to sell you insurance, but isn't necessarily a holistic, well-rounded financial advisor. And most of the time in that case, what's going to happen is they're going to try to sell you a product. In the life insurance example, usually they'll try to upsell you a product called whole life insurance because they'll tell you it's a good investment. It's usually not the product that you need. So when it comes to hiring a financial planner, my recommendation is to look for two things. First of all, the designation Certified Financial Planner, also referred to as a CFP. Mm-hmm. These are folks who have gone through a certain amount of training, who have gone through a certain amount of testing. And it's actually, I think the current numbers like 75 or 80,000 people have this designation, which is actually quite low compared to the at-large number of financial advisors that exist. You can use services like XYPN, XY Planning Network, or Garrett Financial Advisors to research and look for these folks. But the CFP board actually has a tool also called Let's Make a Plan, I think .org, where you can find people who are also specific to like your area of concern. For example, retirement planning. And you can also find people that like specific to your area, even if it's virtual, and all of these other needs that you might have. Retirement planning, estate planning, different moments, inflection points in life that you should hire somebody. The other thing that you want to consider, so you want a CFP who is automatically, if you're a CFP, you are known as a fiduciary. There are two different standards when it comes to how people give us advice: fiduciary and suitability standard. Fiduciary means that they are required to do what is in the best interest of you, the client. Suitability basically means they cannot actively harm you, which is a pretty broad term. And essentially what we want to think about is fiduciary, they are doing what's in your absolute best interest. Suitability is like, well, it's like not a bad product that I'm going to be putting into your financial plan. So you want a fiduciary, CFP. And the final thing is it's very simple to work with somebody who is what is called fee only. Anytime you work with a financial professional, or frankly, any professional, it's good to know how they earn their money. So if somebody works off commission, it means that they have an incentive to sell you the product that nets them the most commission, which fundamentally can conflict with the product that is actually best for you. Suitability standard. So when it comes to a CFP, a fee-only CFP means that you just pay them money and they're giving you the recommendations and advice. They do not make commission off of anything that they're recommending to you. There's a term called fee-based, which can mean like there's a mix of commission and fee. And if that's the case, just make sure you have a very clear understanding of how and when they can actually earn a commission. So if you're going to hire somebody to help you with your finances, fiduciary, certified financial planner who is fee only is the cleanest, easiest way to find somebody who's going to give you good quality advice. And I do think that there is still a very big misunderstanding about when we can hire somebody to help us with our money, because we still have this idea of like, I have to be a millionaire who's like an old white dude to be eligible to have a financial planner. And that's just not true anymore. Technology has been a huge game changer in this regard. But you really can, and you can virtually have conversations with like real life CFPs. You can find somebody who is willing to work with you on maybe just a one-time plan or have a more ongoing relationship with you to help you with your investments, your estate planning, your retirement planning, all of these major inflection points. And the times that we need to hire these people are typically like big life milestones. Maybe you got married and you're merging your financial life with another person. Maybe you got your first big book deal and all of a sudden your cash flow and your overall financial situation has changed. Maybe you inherited after somebody died and you weren't expecting this kind of an estate and you want to figure out what to do with your money. Maybe you have a ton of student loan debt to pay off and you're feeling very overwhelmed about how to do it. So birth of a child, anything that's like a big life moment tends to be a time that we should consider hiring professional help.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really helpful. So we're talking about what to do with your money, but I guess I want to dial it back a little and say, how do you get money? So I'm thinking specifically about how do we make sure that we're getting a rate that we should be paying for the work that we're doing? How do we make sure we're not undercutting someone else with the rate that we're charging? How do we exist in this microcosm?
you talk to other people. It is so awkward at the beginning to be having these conversations. And I fully recognize that literally my job is to write about money. So it like makes it a little bit easier to start the conversation. Because first of all, when I'm asking, it's usually somebody else who kind of does the work that I do. We're all used to talking about money, but it is incredibly important to ask your peers, hey, how much did you make for that? And there are a few different ways that you can do this. One of the easiest is the over-under strategy. Hi, you can also cold pitch. It doesn't necessarily have to be somebody that you know, but it's helpful in the beginning if it is. But let's say you're in Philly, it's a fellow writer who works in Philly. You have similar levels in terms of career and accolade. Therefore, you're kind of controlling for the factors that might make pay rates different. And you can say, hey, I noticed that you wrote for such and such magazine, and I actually was planning to pitch there. And I'm just curious, did you earn over or under $500 for your story? They say over. You can follow up with, okay, over under $1,000. You can kind of keep pushing to try to get the ballpark of how much they actually charge. Hopefully the response is, oh, actually, thanks for asking. I made $1,200 on my 800-word article for them. And it was like X amount of back and forth in order to get it into a situation where it was publishable. Same with advances, being able to talk to other people who are in similar life stages or maybe were at some point in a similar stage to where you are in your career. How much did you get for your advance? We often get very precious about that kind of information, but the only people that are benefiting from that are the publishing houses, or the magazines, or the newspapers, are the people who are paying us. If we don't share that information with each other, it's really hard for us all to understand what the market will bear. And I'll give a very real life example for me. This would have been 6 or 7 years ago. So I had started Broke Millennial as a blog back in 2013. So I was probably 3 years into doing the writing. I still had my day job. And I was really treating every opportunity that came in the door as just like, oh, this is like a fun side project. I wasn't really thinking about it like a business. And I was pricing it that way too. And part of the problem with that is because I had this steady day job income, I would just sort of think like, oh, this amount of money sounds like a good amount of money. Great. I got a call from someone about an opportunity to go and do a speaking engagement. It was a panel discussion. I live in New York City. The opportunity was in Seattle. So that was going to take really at least 3 days of my time. If you think about flying out there, then the next day doing the gig, and then the next day flying back. And when I was on the phone with the person, I was asked immediately, how much would you charge? You can always say, I would like to think about that and get back to you. You do not have to answer in the moment. I answered in the moment. I was like, $3,000 plus travel expenses. Now, mind you, I had done a few of these. I had a bit of a following. And this was back in 2016 that I was quoting this rate. And I thought, oof, that's a lot of money. And the woman on the phone said, great, sounds good. Like, oof, that's not great for me. If there is absolutely no counter, I know that I've undercut myself most of the time. So long story short, I get to Seattle. There is another person on this panel, also a woman, also around my age, also lives in New York City, has been doing the same type of work I have for about the same amount of time. Like truly every control factor that you can think of has been controlled for. I know her pretty well. We went out to dinner. After a couple of drinks, I work up the courage to be like, hey, how much did you charge for this? And she says, $10,000. I had no idea you could make that kind of money for that kind of work. And I never would have charged that amount of money if I hadn't have asked her. Like to this day, I would probably still be working up towards that kind of a price tag because I didn't know that that is what the market can bear. Now, that is not what every speaking opportunity that comes my way is going to pay, but it is really important to know that if it's, for a major financial institution and you're flying across the country, you can make a good chunk of change. So asking each other is not going to hurt another person's pocketbook, because fundamentally the other key thing here is if we all start raising our rates, then we're going to collectively lift how much people get paid. Because I do think a lot of times people, again, get precious with this information because they think, well, if you try to charge that, then I'm not going to get this money anymore. Well, in my mind, when I tell someone who asks me, hey, you write for this outlet, how much do you charge? I tell them immediately how much I charge and all the work that goes into that particular gig. Because my thought is, I want you to charge at least this, maybe even a little bit more, so that when I go back to the negotiating table here in a year, the precedent has been set that this is the baseline and we should be moving up. Not like, well, hey, this person over here actually charges less than you do now, so like we don't think we need to give you a raise.
Yeah, absolutely. So that leads me then to the question that I feel like is on a lot of people's minds when this comes up is, well, what if the person hiring me gets upset or they say no? Or like, how do I manage that situation so I don't actually lose the job because I probably need that income also?
Well, there's a couple of factors here. The first one is fundamentally, we want to be putting ourselves in a position where no one client is a make or break for all of our income. So think about how we would talk, if you read anything about investing, they're always like, diversify your investments. You don't want, it's just a way to say you don't want all your eggs in one basket. The same is true for us as self-employed people, as freelancers. You do not want one client that makes up 60, 70% of your income, because you are very beholden then to that one particular client. You want a nice diversity of income streams. And that really does then give you the power when you're in negotiations to be like, I'm going to have to walk away then if you're not going to meet my rate. Or the bigger thing too is to think about how can we negotiate, maybe historically I have written 2 articles a month for you for $2,000. And now I've raised my rates to the point where we're at 2 articles a month for $2,500 at these other outlets. And if they're unwilling to come up, well, maybe it's a reduction of, okay, how about 1 a month for $1,000? That's still within your budget. It's a little less work for you, but still provides a bit of income. We sometimes have this scarcity mentality around our pricing, where we're willing to do a lot of work for very little money, as opposed to having 1 or 2 pieces of quality work for more money. And that is just a really hard reframe for a lot of us to work through, is a sort of scarcity mentality of, I have to take every opportunity. I have to say yes to everything. That also zaps the bandwidth that you have for your other creative projects. So you do have to figure out how to set boundaries for yourself. And one of the key things that I would recommend you do is have what I call a bare essential budget. What is the least amount of money that you need to meet all of your needs in a month? Bare essential. Like, we're stripping out all of the extras, all of the fun stuff of life, but lights on, utility bills obviously paid, rent or mortgage paid, childcare or pet care if you have kids, transportation costs, medicine, minimum debt payments, all of that. What is my bare essential budget? This is a way too then to think about, what is the bare amount that I then need every single month from my business? I would eventually like you to reframe to more of an abundance mentality. But I think that when you're starting and when you are dealing with scarcity mentality, it's good to have the hey, I need to make at least $8,000 a month to put money aside to pay for taxes, to put money aside to put into my retirement account, and to be able to pay myself. That's really important. The other thing, I'm going to actually take this as an opportunity to pivot back to how you structure your money as a self-employed person. I made a reference to business accounts earlier, and I think it's really important to think again of yourself as a business person, even as a creative, and you want complete separation of business you and personal you. Business you needs to have your own business account. It is a checking account. You can do checking and savings, but you need to at least have a business checking account. Every time you get paid for the work that you're doing, that money goes into your business account. Personal you pays yourself from your business account. Now, for me, when I did this, it completely revolutionized how I was able to not only budget and handle my money month to month, but just think through my finances, because we go through these big boom times when we have all this money coming in, but then we're usually tempted to spend a lot of that money, especially if it's commingled with your personal accounts. But if you put all of that into a business account and then start to pay yourself just a steady salary every single month, well, hey, then when you're in lean times, you still have the surplus from those really good times that are still in your business account. So you can continue to pay yourself a steady salary, and that stabilizes what you're able to do in your personal life. Now, it takes a little bit of time to get there, obviously, but once you start to do that separation, it really does help keep business you and personal you not only separate, which is also very helpful for the IRS and for taxes, but it makes sure that, like, hey, me as personal Erin, I am paying myself every month from Broke Millennials earnings. And that way I can, save towards different financial goals that I have. I can spend money how I want to spend my money every month because I have this level of stability that I'm gifting myself by putting those structures into place.
Amazing. Wonderful. Thank you. So I also wanted to go back to, you mentioned the speaking engagement story, which is a great story. And it made me start to think about how to diversify the work that you do as a writer. So I think a lot about, like, okay, I put words on a page and I sold that, and that's how I make my money. But it almost sounds like there might be some other opportunities that I'm not thinking of.
There are so many opportunities as a creative person. And for one, yes, selling your writing is kind of like obviously stage one, but there's even different versions of that. There is writing a novel and selling that and getting an advance and eventually, hopefully, getting your royalty money. Then there is working as more of the journalist or an essayist and selling your work to different magazines and newspapers. Then you could also be a technical writer. You could be a ghost writer. Like, there's so many different types of writing that exists out there. So even just diversifying the type of people, the networking opportunities, which now that those are like kind of coming back in person, that you're going to, understanding different types of writing that is out there. Then there's also coaching. I know a lot of people who are a book coach, an author coach, a writing coach. So once you get a little further along and more established in your career, maybe you are so excellent at condensing people's thoughts or helping people find focus and structure, or editing. You could be an editor on the side, even though, like, writing is really more of your passion. For people who also start to develop a little bit of a following on social media, whether that's Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, what have you, there's opportunities for brand partnerships, working with companies. Then, of course, there's also speaking engagement opportunities. And those exist in so many different ways. And some of that is just pitching yourself, or if somebody compliments your work, who you see, hey, this person actually works at a really cool company, I would love to come in sometime and speak to your colleagues about XYZ thing, or I'd love to come in and run a workshop around XYZ thing. So what are your hobbies? What are your abilities outside of writing that could actually maybe be monetized? I will caution a little bit on monetizing a hobby. It, like, very quickly stops being fun as soon as you monetize a hobby, but there might just be other ways to think about your whole self as opposed to just your writer self, and how that can be turned into different types of work and opportunities, particularly around, like, speaking engagements or any sort of brand partnership type of work.
It's making me think a little bit about almost the question of, like, how do you build yourself as a brand? Like, you mentioned being on TikTok and people following you, and that's sort of how some of these other opportunities open up. And I feel like sometimes that can be at odds with something you mentioned earlier, this feeling of, like, well, I'm an artist, I don't want to, like, make myself into a brand. And so I'm curious, one, like, are there boundaries that you've thought about yourself as an artist versus yourself as a brand? And two, are there strategies to leverage yourself as a brand that you're like, these are the top 3 things that you should be doing?
We currently live in an environment where, like, fundamentally we're all brands. And I know everybody hates hearing that, but unfortunately it's the reality. And frankly, having a following, whether that is a very successful newsletter with a good mailing list, whether that is a lot of followers on Instagram or TikTok, that is going to help sell your book. And I know people hate to hear it, but it is 100% the truth. And it will impact your advance. It will impact how much support you get really from publicity from your publisher. Like, just so much of that all feeds into the machine that we now face in terms of how our world works. And yes, of course, there are outliers. But for the most part, particularly if you're a first-time author, they want to see stats, and they want to see that you can do media. They want to see examples of maybe places that you've written or times that you've been interviewed. They want to see how you do on camera. So it is worth also thinking about ways to improve those skill sets for yourself, if it's not something you currently have. This might sound like a strange suggestion, but take an improv class. You want to talk about getting outside of your comfort zone, having to be an active listener, having to think on your feet. Ooh, that will do it for you, especially if that's not something that you naturally feel comfortable doing. It's a great way to improve public speaking without necessarily doing Toastmasters, which is another good option if that's something that you're interested in. So all of those, just thinking about ways that, yes, sides of you are also a business and sides of you are an artist. Now, when it comes to the boundaries and protecting yourself, first of all, you don't have to put anything on social media that you are uncomfortable with. You do not have to mine every element and every facet of your life for social media, for building of this brand. For me personally, I have basically two separate personalities. I have Broke Millennial, like all of my things online are billed under Broke Millennial. And then I'm Erin Lowry. And I joke that my Finstagram, my fake Instagram is actually just like the real me, where I exclusively follow like dog accounts and Bravo celebrities. And it's private. I limit who can be there. If I don't know you personally, you are not following me on that account. And then I've got Broke Millennial, unfortunately on Instagram, it's Broke Millennial blog and not just regular Broke Millennial, where you get all the access, but it's still just what I personally am putting up. It's mostly about money. Occasionally I show my dog. Occasionally I show my husband. My husband has a pseudonym in all of my work. I do not use his real name. I call him Peach on everything I have for the last 10 years. We have even done media together and he gets referred to as Peach. So you have to decide where your boundaries are. I also write about personal finance. So I share very personal stories, but if it's something about my household finances, things in my marriage, arguments my husband and I have had about money, we have a conversation first before I share that. Anything that I share, he is also okay with me sharing because it's also boundaries that he gets to create around my art. Same with stories from my family. If I'm sharing something about my childhood, it's fair for them to be able to have a say on how much of their information they want shared. So kind of this idea of like ethics around who gets to be the narrator of other people's stories. Same holds true for social media. And you need to think about in 10 years, will you have wanted this on the internet? And I know that that's a very hard game to play. Like we don't want to always be playing defense when we think about building brands, but it can be exclusively dedicated to certain elements of your work and not about your whole real life. You do not have to share every element of who you actually are. And instead you could just be out there promoting certain parts of your work.
Absolutely. I think about social media as a networking tool as well. And it makes me wonder a little bit about how do you have honest relationships within your networking? And I want to bring this back, of course, to finances in particular, because sometimes these are relationships with people who are going to hire you eventually. So how do you build that in a healthy way, but in a way that's going to get you the money too?
Not only just get you money, but get you exposure. I think as authors, that's a really big thing to be thinking about is building relationships with the media early on. And a big part of that, I mean, first of all, we throw the term authentic around a lot where like mixed bag, like it's okay if you're promoting your book to call in every favor that you have ever done for somebody else to help with your book promotion. I don't think that that's inauthentic. That is a natural part of the extension of the promotion process. And a lot of people who do your kind of work are going to know and understand that. The bigger thing is that you're just not making an ask of someone every time you have an interaction with them. That if you're, interacting with journalists on Twitter, you maybe are suggesting different people that could be a source for an article that they just tweeted about. And not every time it's like, me, I could do that. Maybe it's like, oh my gosh, here's somebody else in my network from over here that you probably don't know that would be a great source for this article or for this story or to be an editor or to do this job. Pulling other people within your network into each other to meet each other, that is actually a very advantageous way to expand your network and to be seen as somebody who helps do favors for other people, who is not just entirely self-serving in this process. I know sometimes the idea of networking can feel kind of icky, but think about what we do for our just like general friends who have no bearing on our professional lives. Like every once in a while, your friends be like, hey, I'm moving. Want to come over and help pack some boxes? I'll buy the pizza. You don't want to, but it's like part of friendship. we also might like age out of that where it's like, no, I'm not doing this anymore. That was when we were 22, we're 35, now I'm done, which is a perfectly fine boundary to set. But there are just moments where you drop everything to help a particular person in your life, not because of like a tit for tat situation, but because like you genuinely have a relationship. And there's just different levels of relationships when we also think about work. And sometimes the people that we can connect with online, particularly if you live in a major city or close to one, easily can turn into real life friendships. Some of my like very close friends today are folks that I met on the internet 5-10 years ago as I started working in this space, and started with just tweet interactions and then progressed to coffee. And now like we hang out all the time and we're real life friends and very rarely talk about work. So just also thinking about the positive sides of being active and being on the internet and being on social media. And frankly, if it all feels exhausting and taxing and tiring, you don't have to do it. There is opportunity cost of that, but you don't have to do it.
Yeah, I also think a lot about networking with people who are sort of the same level as I am. So I think that we often think about networking as like somebody who's way far up there and you want to get to where they are. But I found that a lot of the people who are kind of rising up in the way that I have now have opportunities that we can sort of share with each other.
Yeah, and cross-recommend people for stuff. That's a great way to network. And I mean, it's a weird way to word it, like networking down, but helping people who are at a different stage of their career development. And whether that's kind of through just mentorship or a conversation, collaborations, being sort of a sponsor for them in their career, that's also really important, because you want to be, again, helping other people come up behind you as well and not gatekeeping the access that you have earned.
Absolutely. So as we're getting into the last 10 minutes of our session, I'd love to ask you, what have you been burning to talk about that we haven't hit yet?
A couple of things that I feel like I just want to follow up on that we've already discussed. One, the retirement element. You have your business and your personal accounts. Every single time I get paid, 40% of my paycheck goes not into my business account. It goes into a separate account called Uncle Sam's Money. It is a checking account, and it's like a business checking account, but I have actually titled it Uncle Sam's Money, and it gets set aside to pay my taxes. And I do 40%, which is actually very high. Rules of thumb are typically around 30%. People say, accountants will usually say, put aside 30% of your paycheck for taxes. I do 40% for a couple of reasons. One, as I mentioned, I live in New York City. So I have the gift of paying state, city, and federal tax. So I have an extra tax compared to a lot of other folks. Also, if you run your own business, you might be paying like an LLC or some sort of incorporated business tax. You're probably also paying a self-employment tax. So I like to have a big buffer. And on top of that, any leftovers after I pay my quarterly estimated tax gets dumped into my SEP IRA. So it's a way to keep me honest about constantly putting money aside, prioritizing investing for retirement. So that's one really simple rule that you can implement for yourself in terms of, hey, now I know I have enough money set aside for my tax bill and my bill that I am doing to myself with putting aside money for retirement. So that's one that I think is super important. Two, navigating awkward financial conversations. So the kind of conversations about how much do you make, but also to go back to that idea of if somebody says no. This is true of any negotiation, whether it's like freelancing, whether it's like, hey friend, I can't afford to do this thing that you want to do. Can we do something else? And they say no. Then you have to decide what you're going to do. So let's say it's for a job, first and foremost. That can be like, okay, thank you for considering. I would still like to take this opportunity if you still want to take it. So you tried to negotiate for more. They came back with a firm no. Okay, thank you for considering. I'm still happy to proceed. Great. Or, okay, thank you for considering. Unfortunately, with the other projects I have going on right now, this simply just doesn't fit into my bandwidth. But I would love to have a conversation in the future if you ever have a larger budget, something like that. I wouldn't ever burn a bridge in these scenarios because you just never know what the future is going to hold. You also should, I would say, anytime you're going to quote a fee to somebody, think about two things. One, just like tack on an extra 10 to 15% to that number, because like I guarantee that you're undercutting yourself, because we pretty much all do that. So that baseline number you had in your head, add 10 to 15%. The other thing to consider, is there a pain and suffering tax that you want to be adding for this particular client? Because not all clients are created equal. And some clients, you just know, either because you've worked with them before or they have a type of reputation or the type of client that they are. Like I know when I work with corporate clients, it's going to be a pain. Like I know I'm going to have to follow up about getting paid. I know that I'm going to have to jump through a ton of paperwork and hoops. I know that they're going to want to be on a phone call like every other day for stuff. So I charge them more. And I think about it like, don't tell them this, but like you think about it like pain and suffering tax. And I know when I work with creatives, I normally get paid real quick. So that's just the fun difference. One of them tends to pay a lot more, but takes a lot longer to give me the money. And you also can split how you get paid. There are some scenarios where I request a certain deposit, like a certain percentage upfront before I am willing to go further in the partnership, whether it's because I've been burned by this type of client before, or simply because like, hey, this helps with my cash flow. If I take a 50% deposit on certain works, that helps me instead of like, oh, I'm going to have to wait 90 days until the end of this project and then another 30 to 60 before I see this income.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all amazing tips. One thing I'm wondering about is sometimes we have these clients where maybe we're doing work for them every month or things like that. And then sometimes circumstances change. Like it might even be like a personal life circumstance or something like that. And how do you then have a conversation with them about shifting expectations when you've kind of already said yes to something and now you're not feeling like that's the right situation?
Well, first, I would reread your contract and have a really good understanding of contractually what have you obligated yourself to. You know, are you like 2 months away from the fulfillment of a year-long contract? And if so, are you in a position that maybe you could finish out those 2 months and then have a conversation at a renewal point? If not, or if you're like, yeah, there's 2 months, but like, I just can't anymore. Then you need to have a conversation and you need to decide how much you're willing to divulge to the other person. You know, maybe it was like the loss of a close loved one and you're like, I'm dealing with some pretty bad grief and depression right now, and it's impacting my overall ability to work. A lot of people, especially now, are very open to mental health related conversations, but you need to be comfortable sharing that information with that person. If you're not, that's okay. You could just say, for personal reasons, I'm currently scaling back. And I was just curious if we could potentially put our contract on pause for the next 2 months, or if you could give me XYZ amount of extension. Obviously, I don't expect to be paid during these months that we're putting on pause, et cetera, et cetera. One of the best things that you can do for yourself as a freelancer is to very diligently work on building up the buffer in your business account so that you can take time off if and when you need it. I took off about 4 months last year. There's one client that I kept during that time because we had a year-long contract. And there was a period in which it was an article outlet that I write for twice a month. And one of those 4 months, I front-loaded writing, and my editor was willing to work with me to edit 4 articles instead of 2 in that month, so that there was 1 month that I 100% went offline. But listen, I wrote 3 books in 4 years and did a bunch of other work and like really burned myself out and ignored all of the hallmark signals of burnout. And we were in a pandemic and I live in New York City and like a bunch of other stuff was happening in my life. I'm like, I can't, I have to take time off. And I knew ahead of time that I was going to try to set myself up for that. About like, I would say 4 months before I took the 4 months off, I reduced how much I was spending every month. I reduced how much I was taking in income to help with the rebuild and to help with the buffer. And then I took a project that I didn't like super want to do, but had a really big price tag associated with it, and just thought of it as like, hey, this is going to pay for my sabbatical. And sometimes that can also be the answer, like short-term pain for a long-term gain, as long as it's not going to like drastically hurt your mental health to do as well. But really do think about your mental health and like take the time that you need off, assuming that financially you can support yourself through it.
Yeah, I think that for me has been one of the hardest things about not being in a traditional job situation anymore is you don't get that PTO, you don't get those sick days, you don't get the HSA, you don't get all of those little perks.
Hey, if you have a high deductible health plan, you still could be eligible for an HSA and you can set up your own HSA. You won't have somebody that's like contributing to it, but HSA is a health savings account that is, in some states, triple tax advantage because you get reduction on your taxes when you contribute. It grows tax-free. And in many states, you can take the money out tax-free for medical costs, and it doesn't expire. So if you're putting money in, for the next 2 years, and then you can wait till you're 55 in retirement to start using it. So something to consider if you have a high deductible health plan to see if you're eligible for an HSA.
See, I love it. Every little thing you have a really good tip about. I love that. So we're in the last few minutes. I don't see any open questions now, but if anybody wants to throw anything in the Q&A, please feel free to. Otherwise, Erin, again, is there anything else that you wanted to share with us or have us think about?
I just would challenge everybody to have one awkward financial conversation by the end of this week. And that is either boundary setting, like a friend or a partner, about how much you want to spend on something, maybe negotiating for a higher rate with a current client or something that comes into your inbox, or just, overall financially advocating for yourself in some way, shape, or form. Even practicing negotiating in very low stakes ways. One of my favorites is to go into a coffee shop, right before close, order a coffee and be like, could I have 50% off a pastry since it's the end of the day? Just try. I mean, they might just say no. And if it's a place that you go to all the time that's beloved, maybe try Starbucks or something else where you don't care what they think of you. But it's just a great way to practice asking a potentially awkward question of someone and practice negotiating in a super low stakes environment.
That's an amazing kind of call to action. But before I let everyone go, we did have one question come in the Q&A. So we'll probably end with that, which is, have you ever come across accountants or CFPs that deal specifically with creatives?
Oh, yes, especially accountants. There are actually plenty of accountants that will market themselves towards creatives, or bookkeepers that market themselves towards creatives. Paco de Leon of Hell Yeah Bookkeeping. She's based out in California. She's an author. She's a creative, but she also has a bookkeeping company and service. And then I would just ask fellow creative friends too, if they have accountants that they would recommend. Man, one of my friends just recommended, it was a very, I think, Brass Taxes or something that he uses that's also a creative accountant agencies. But yeah, Google that. Things will be revealed to you on the internet, or just ask your fellow creative friends. But there certainly are accountants. And then when it comes to CFPs, there are CFPs who have experience specifically with creatives or were creatives themselves before they pivoted into being financial planners. So they have a particular love for that.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Erin. Please follow Erin on social media, keep track of her. I also put in the chat another webinar that Erin was part of with a few other creatives as well, if you're looking for more of this. Otherwise, get out there, have your hard financial conversation of the week, and we will see everyone soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.